Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Ice Cream for PRs podcast. My name is Jeff Nippard, and joining me this week, I've got a gentleman, James Krieger, on the line. So James is the founder of Weightology LLC, which is a subscription-based research review that I strongly recommend. He actually holds two master's degrees, so one in nutrition and the other in exercise science. He's worked with some pretty big names, from the founder of the Sylvan Learning Center, the vice president of Costco, as in the grocery chain, and also a former vice president of MSN. So some pretty decent credentials there in terms of coaching clients. And James is also a published author, so he's published work in scientific journals, including the Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and he's written over 250 articles on training and nutrition. So it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast, James. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
For sure. So before we get into things, and I do want to talk to you mostly about training volume today, I was just wondering, do you have any current fitness-related goals for yourself? Like, I know you did a physique contest probably a few months ago, was it now? Or
Yeah, I did a physique contest back in end of September. And I kind of would like to do one again, but I need to put on quite a bit more size. I'm going to spend the next couple years just seeing what I can do. I'm 42 years old now, so it's getting harder and harder to put size on.
yeah.
But I want to see what I can do. Especially, I'm experimenting now with high frequency training, and kind of really want to see how that goes. I'm only 2 months into it, or not even 2 months, really 6 weeks into a program I kind of developed for myself, and I'm so far happy with it. But it's way too early really to tell how it's going to go. Yeah. So if I can put on some more size over the next couple of years. I placed second in the novice class in my show, but to compete in the open, I got to have more size than what I have. Probably not like a huge amount more size, but definitely a decent amount more. So we'll see what I can do. So
I thought you looked good. Like, I saw some photos on Facebook, and like for a first show, like your conditioning was good, and like your abs were good, and the chest was there. Like, I thought you had a nice look. So I'm sure.
Oh yeah, thanks.
After an off season, like after the first show, I feel like as long as you take enough time, then you tend to make pretty good improvements, even if you have been training for a while. At least that's what I've seen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was actually curious, what division was it, or what organization rather was it that you?
It was I think WNBF.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so that's what I'm a pro in. So
Yeah.
I think that's the best organization, but I'm a little biased, of course. So I wanted to get into talking about training volume. I know this is something that you've written quite a bit about. So as I see it, it's become relatively uncontroversial within the bodybuilding community that sort of volume is king. So like that's the sort of main driver of progress, especially in the sort of science-based community or whatever. And I know you published a paper in 2010 that sort of looked into the question of whether single sets versus multiple sets are better for hypertrophy. So I was hoping maybe you could just talk a little bit about sort of what you found in that paper, and the applications of it.
Yeah. So when I did that paper, let me give you some background on it. One of the problems you have with weight training studies in general is the sample sizes are pretty small. You usually have 10 people per group, and when you're trying to measure hypertrophy, number one, there's a lot of variance from one person to the next and how they'll respond to a training program. And then the other problem is changes in muscle size are pretty small. And so when you got a lot of variance from one person to the next, and you're trying to measure small changes, it can be really difficult if you're trying to compare two different training programs over a say 12-week period. It can be really difficult to see differences between groups, even if a difference might exist. I mean, just because the magnitude of the differences are too small, and your number of subjects is you just don't have enough subjects. And I had actually, when I wrote that paper, in the intro, I included an example. I picked out one study, and I don't recall the authors off the top of my head, but they compared, I think, 6 sets to 1 set of bicep curls, and then I think a leg exercise. I don't remember what the leg exercise was. It was either leg press or leg extension. I don't remember. And they didn't see any statistically significant differences between the groups, but when you look at the data, the mean increases in the 6-set group were quite a bit different from the 1-set group, and I did what's called a power analysis, which kind of tells you, okay, well, how many subjects would you need to actually make that statistically significant? Well, you would have needed like almost 100 subjects per group, and you just don't get resistance training studies with that many people per group. So you're going to get a lot of studies that'll show no differences, even if maybe a difference that exists. So the reason I did the meta-analysis is one thing that you can do is, okay, well, maybe I don't have enough subjects in each individual study, but maybe if I can compile a bunch of studies together, I can see if there's some type of trend that I can detect.
Right.
And so I did the analysis, and unfortunately there weren't a lot of single versus multiple set studies that looked at hypertrophy. I ended up only, I think, with 8 studies or something like that, which is not a very large amount. But I did see an effect of training volume, at least in sets per, I did it in sets per exercise. And, I think 3 sets per exercise, I think you had around 40% greater effect sizes compared to 1 set. And then 4 to 6 sets per exercise was even bigger, but it wasn't statistically significant compared to 3 at the time. But there was only a couple studies that used 4 to 6 sets per exercise, so that was kind of hard to do that. So there was definitely a dose-response relationship when I did that paper at the time. The interesting thing is now is Brad Schoenfeld and I have actually done an updated version basically of that paper, because there's a lot of research that's come out since then.
Right.
And we recently submitted it now for publication. So it's in review right now. So I can't really say much about it right now since it's in review, but it definitely gives more information than what was available when the last time I did the analysis. So.
Oh, that's very interesting. So there are a couple things I'd just like for you to just sort of clarify with what you said there. So effect size, can you just briefly explain what that term is in case people don't have the statistics background? And then
an effect size, or go ahead with the other question, then I'll answer.
Sorry. There was another one, but let's just go with effect size first.
Yeah. So an effect size is a fancy statistical measure for the meaningfulness of an effect. And what effect sizes allow you to do is it allows you to compare different types of measurements. So let's take hypertrophy example. There are different ways you can measure hypertrophy. You can do, let's say, muscle fiber area, or you can look at overall muscle circumference, for example, or you can look at lean body mass in the arms and legs and that type of thing. Those are all measures of hypertrophy, but they all have different scales and everything. So basically what you're trying to do is an effect size is really it's a standardized way of taking these different measurements, creating one number and giving you a meaningfulness of an effect. Unfortunately, it's harder to translate back into something meaningful like percent gains or something like that. In the paper that Brad and I have submitted, I did an additional analysis that would at least give some meaningfulness to the numbers in terms of percent gains. But yeah, that's what an effect size is. It's just it's like a standardized measurement, really.
Sure. And then the other thing you said was dose-response relationship.
Yeah.
So can you just elaborate on that briefly?
Yeah, dose response really, I mean, think of it in terms of a drug, right? Most drugs have a dose response. So if you increase the dose of the drug, let's say it's ibuprofen, right? And I take 200 milligrams, and then I take 400 milligrams, and I take 800 milligrams. The response of my body will increase for each increasing dose up to a point, and then that response will plateau off. And then if you take too much, then obviously the response could actually be negative or something that you don't, you could get negative side effects and things like that. So that's what we talk about when we talk about a dose response effect.
Right. So in this context, you're essentially saying that there is a dose response relationship. So as you add sets, of a given exercise, there's more hypertrophy seen, and that would be the response.
Yes.
Up to a point.
Yeah.
So based on the data that we have, where would you speculate that point might be? So I mean, based on your paper, you said 3 sets is better than 1 set by about 40%. 4 to 6 sets might be better, but it's not statistically significant.
Yeah.
Where would you probably draw that line?
Well, the interesting thing is, so, when I did that paper, it was sets per exercise. In the new paper I've done with Brad, we actually looked at weekly volume in terms of sets per muscle group, which I think is a better way to look at it. Because if you do, let's say you're doing multiple exercises per muscle group and things like that, it can kind of make things a little bit convoluted. So we did a weekly sets per muscle group, and so I'll give you some hints. I can't talk too much about the paper, but basically, we saw an increasing dose-response relationship all the way up into double-digit sets per week. And unfortunately, there's not enough studies that do double-digit sets per week where we can identify, well, where does it plateau off, right? So all I can say is at this point is
more is
the
better.
data definitely indicates more is better.
Right.
Where that point is, where it really plateaus off, I'm not sure. Certainly, you're going to get most of your benefit in, a good chunk of your benefit in the lower volume. And then obviously there's still going to be a point of diminishing returns. But our data right now indicates that if you want to maximize hypertrophy, you'd actually want to be in the double digit sets per week as far as your weekly sets. So
okay, so 10 or at least 10.
Yeah, at least 10 per week. Yeah.
Interesting.
So
okay,
but we need more studies. We need
yeah.
We need studies that do 20 to 30 per week, so you can identify kind of, okay, well, where does it plateau off?
Right.
And
Yeah.
So I know Brad has a proposal out to do a study just like that on trained subjects, because the interesting thing is there's only one really one study on trained subjects right now that looks at a dose-response relationship in terms of volume and hypertrophy, and that's one by Ostrowski, and that was published all the way back in like 1999 or something like that. So, or 98, I don't remember the exact year. So, and that's the only study on trained subjects that looks at hypertrophy in a dose response. So, so definitely there's a need for more data on trained subjects.
So I mean, like, apart from your meta-analysis, which itself was comprised of 8 studies,
Yeah.
I think 7 of which actually didn't detect an effect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you think it's like jumping the gun a little bit to say that like volume is definitely the driver of progress, or would it maybe seem more reasonable to say, well, taking sets to failure or at least close to failure might be more scientifically grounded at present, but we can speculate that volume is important? Or
I'm not sure I would agree with that, and the reason I say that is this. Number one, while we don't have much training studies, like good dose response training studies, we do have protein synthesis data, and there's probably 3 or 4 studies out there that have looked at set volume and protein synthesis response, and it shows a clear relationship that as you increase training volume, you stimulate more protein synthesis in muscle, which is really the driver of hypertrophy, is synthesizing new muscle protein. So that data would agree with the meta-analysis type data and outcomes that we have. Regarding training to failure, the interesting thing there is, again, in terms of hypertrophy, there's not much research out there comparing failure versus non-failure training, and some of the research that has been done has a lot of limitations in the way they do it. So, for example, there's one study out there. Well, they didn't measure. Well, a number of studies didn't even look at hypertrophy, and the few that have, there's one that I'm familiar with. They looked at lean body mass and not necessarily hypertrophy, but they compared a failure group to a non-failure group, and there was no difference. So, I would say on a volume equated basis. So I would say there's probably a small edge to training to failure, but it's pretty small, at least from the data that I've seen. But then you think about, well, why would you not train to failure? Well, really the reason we wouldn't actually, I guess I should put it this way. On a volume equated basis, there may be a slight edge to training to failure, but really the whole reason you don't train to failure is to allow you to do more volume, right? so really thinking it in terms of a volume equated basis isn't really the way to look at it, because the whole reason you might not train to failure is to allow yourself to do more sets, with a certain amount of weight and do more volume. So, um, um, so yeah, I would still say, I would still say, oh, and then there's a few other studies that look at volume load and hypertrophy. There's um, out of Stu Phillips' lab, he had some studies on protein synthesis and training volume, and they did I think it was 3 sets of 30% 1 RM to failure. Then they had 3 sets of 30% 1 RM, but work matched to like a 90% group. And then they had 3 sets at 90% to failure. And the work matched group that did not train to failure did not achieve the same degree of hypertrophy as the 90% group. But the 30% group to failure definitely had the most protein synthesis and everything. But at the same time, they also did the greatest volume, their terms of the volume load. So even that data suggested there was definitely a relationship between volume load and the stimulus for hypertrophy.
Right.
So.
Because see, like when I've interpreted those studies that look at, the very high reps or even like say, some of the more moderate reps.
Yeah.
It seems to be the conclusion that provided they're taken to failure, any of these rep ranges can be effective at maximally stimulating hypertrophy.
And that seems to be true, at least over the short term. I mean, I know Brad would suggest, and I would probably agree, that there may be some benefit to actually mixing repetition ranges because of targeting different fiber types. There's not much research out there to look at, especially in trained subjects. I mean, well, Brad had the good study on where they did, he had on trained subjects where 3 sets of like 30 to 40 reps to failure versus the 3 sets of, I think, 8 to 12 or whatever, and they had a pretty much equivalent hypertrophy. So
yeah.
So I would agree with that to a point. As long as the sets are taken to failure, it's probably not going to be a difference unless the repetitions are so low. So let's say if you do 3 sets of 3 reps to failure, it's not enough volume load to where you're probably going to stimulate much hypertrophy. And I know Brad's got a study in review now, and he kind of hinted that, sounded like, I think it was one group did 3 sets of 3 to 4 reps to failure, and another group did 3 sets of like 8 to 12 reps. And from what he hinted, it sounded like the 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps got superior hypertrophy. So there still seems to be, you still got to get that seems to suggest you still got to get a little bit of volume in there, even if you're taking your sets to failure. And one thing I do want to note, if you're doing really high rep sets, if I do 3 sets of 30 reps to failure versus 3 sets of 8, my volume load actually in the 3 sets to 30 to failure is actually quite a bit higher than 3 sets of 8 or whatever. There's some data to suggest that if I'm doing pretty light weights, let's say less than 60% 1 rep max, I definitely have to do not more volume in terms of sets, but my overall volume load is going to have to be somewhat higher to get similar hypertrophy.
Right.
So
I guess what I would say, in favor of training to failure, one argument would come from a size principle basis.
Yeah.
So you recruit the full spectrum of motor units when you take it to failure. When you don't, it seems as though some motor units are being left unstimulated. And so that seems to be a fairly strong mechanistic case for me. And it just doesn't seem to be, from what I've seen, clear within even the scientific community that 1 set taken to failure might not be sufficient for maximally stimulating hypertrophy. I've at least seen some people who I would consider to be experts in the field make that claim. And then secondly, it would also be that, just from a practical perspective, I feel like when people shy away from failure, they tend to shy away perhaps more than they should. And so maybe they just don't reach that threshold of actually stimulating enough muscle to maximally stimulate hypertrophy. So like practically speaking, when people are said to leave a couple reps in the tank for the sake of maximizing volume, they leave like a lot in the tank and then end up hindering themselves in terms of like pushing themselves a little bit closer to that failure point. And so, so maybe you could address the first one first. So the people who say that all you need is one set taken to failure, so like the low volume, high intensity crowd, and then maybe you can speak to the claim of whether that is the majority view or even a small or a sizable minority view within the community.
So I'll address the one set to failure. First, I will say that definitely one set to failure will achieve hypertrophy. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. I mean, that's been demonstrated in a number of studies and everything. So really, I think the question more becomes, if additional sets provide more hypertrophy, what is the cost benefit ratio in a sense? So, if 3 sets, let's say, takes 3 times as long in the gym, but doesn't give me 3 times the hypertrophy, is that worth it to the person? So really, I think it depends on, the goals of the person. I think for someone who wants to maximize hypertrophy, now I will say there's number one, there's going to be a lot of individual variance, and there's going to be variance in how people respond to volume. But there's too much data to me in terms of protein synthesis data and everything, to suggest to me that one set to failure is going to be equivalent to multiple sets. And the other reason why I'll say that is because let's say I have a body of resistance training studies, let's say 20 studies, right? And let's say half of those show no significant difference between groups and the other half do show a significant difference. Well, actually, let me put it this way. You had mentioned my old meta-analysis. It might be easier to put it in these terms. There were 8 studies in that original meta-analysis. 7 did not show a statistically significant effect for hypertrophy in each individual study. Well, but here's the thing, is that the effect size favored the multiple set group in every single study. Now, if there was truly no difference between the two conditions, if there truly was no difference, what you would actually see is a random variation around 0. So you would see some single set studies showing superiority for single sets, some showing superiority for multiple sets, and then some showing right around like no difference at all. Right. But that's not what you see. You see almost the effect sizes favoring the multiple set group in almost all the studies, which says that there definitely is a benefit to multiple sets, but the tools that we have to measure hypertrophy and the number of subjects we have per study are just not enough to basically say with absolute certainty that, so that's why we have to resort to meta-analyses or looking at the protein synthesis data and things like that. We have to look at more indirect, I guess, type things. I would say for most people, for your average person who's not competing or anything like that, they just want to put on some muscle, I think single sets are perfect, going to work great. But for a lot of people, not necessarily, maybe not everybody, because again, there's going to be genetic variance. I just think there's too much data that weighs towards the higher volumes for hypertrophy, or for maximizing hypertrophy, I would say. Again, in the paper that we just submitted, the people that did double-digit weekly sets, hypertrophy was about 30% more than if you had single-digit weekly sets. So again, now you probably have to spend twice as long in the gym to get 30% more gains, but that's, there's a trade-off there, and it depends on, what exactly are you interested in, so.
So one set to failure will be sufficient to promote hypertrophy,
yes,
but perhaps if you want to max out hypertrophy, then you're going to have to add more volume, but there's going to be diminishing returns on that volume.
Yes.
And then there'll come some point where probably adding more volume would actually be detrimental. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And especially I think not necessarily in terms of the muscle itself, but I think more in terms of your joints and soft tissues and things like that. I think that's where the additional volume can become problematic. So
interesting. And then I suppose the last thing I would just probably have you comment on. So there was a criticism written of your meta-analysis, which I keep going back to just because it's so widely cited as evidence for the dose-response relationship of volume on hypertrophy. And this sort of criticism was written by Fisher in 2012. And basically, I think he titled it "Beware the Meta-Analysis." Yeah. And so I think
I've seen it. I've seen the paper. I've never had a chance to respond to it though. But
okay, fair enough. Well, I think his main point was that, like, in the 8 studies that you looked at, there were so many different variables that could come into play. Like, for example, some groups were trained, some groups were not trained, some were on elderly. I believe one group was on people who had coronary artery disease. So it was like, in pooling these studies together, how reliable are the results that come out the other end, sort of thing. So, I mean, like, I know there was that one study, I forget the author's name right now, but it was actually on trained individuals. I think it was like a 12. Ostrowski, that's the one.
Yeah.
And that showed no significant effect, I believe, or at least in one of the measures. So I guess, could you just comment on how much weight we should be putting into a meta-analysis that is comprised of studies that didn't actually detect an effect for the most part?
So, well, first of all, let me mention the Ostrowski study. They did not, again, this is where I want to get back to statistical significance on one hand. And this is where I really disagree with Fisher and some of his colleagues. I think they really get hung up on statistical significance. Right. And all statistical significance is, it's an arbitrary threshold that has been agreed upon by the scientific community, whether we want to call our results significant or not. Right. Okay. And it's based on a probability value. They usually 0.05, which means if I get a p-value of 0.04, I can call that statistically significant and say, basically, if I were to repeat this experiment 96 out of 100 or 100 times, 96 out of 100, I get the same results, basically, right? Yeah. But here's the problem with that. What if I get a p-value of 0.06 or 0.07? Does that suddenly mean there's no difference? I mean, you're still talking a type 1 error, a probability of a type 1 error, which means a type 1 error, I should say, is where you detected a difference, but there really isn't a difference, of only 6 or 7%. Right. I mean, which is still very low. Yeah. That's why I have a problem with statistical significance. Really, I think what is more important are effect sizes, confidence intervals. I think studies should report the p-values, because to me, if there's a p-value of 0.08 or 0.09, it still could be very meaningful. And so that's one of the problems I have with the Fisher criticism, is that I think they get really hung up on statistical significance when statistical significance is a completely arbitrary threshold. It's completely arbitrary. Second, I want to talk about the Ostrowski study. Again, and this is where statistical significance becomes a problem, because if you actually look at the outcomes, the hypertrophy in the highest volume groups was almost double that of the lower volume groups, but it wasn't statistically significant. Wow. And so
there must have been like a handful of people in the study, or
so there was only like 10 people per group in that study. So I mean, that's what I'm getting at when, there's something, again, I mentioned what's called a type 1 error. There's also in statistics what we call a type 2 error. And what a type 2 error is where I say there's no difference even when there really is. Mm-hmm. And
so it's when you take the pregnancy test and it says you're not pregnant, but you actually are.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the example that I resonate with for some reason.
and the thing is that if I have very small number of subjects per group, I'm going to get a type 2 error a lot, especially with hypertrophy. It's going to happen a lot. And that's why I think we got to be really careful about getting too hung up on statistical significance, because, again, if you look at that Ostrowski study, the group that did double-digit sets per week, in terms of percentage gains, they had basically twice the hypertrophy that the lower volume groups did.
Wow. And just quickly, in that study, were they comparing a single set to three, or was it?
They actually had three groups. They had a group that did one set per exercise, and they had 3 exercises per muscle group. So they had one group that did 1 set per exercise, which is basically 3 sets per muscle group. They had another group that did 2 sets per exercise, which is 6 sets per muscle group. And then they had another group that did 4 sets per exercise, which is 12 sets per muscle group. And so the group that did 12 sets per muscle group, their hypertrophy was definitely better than the other 2 groups. When you look at or I should say 12 weekly sets.
Yeah.
If you look at the quadricep data. If you look at the tricep data, the interesting thing about the tricep data is the group that did the thing about triceps is they actually trained triceps twice per week in that study, where they just did legs once per week. And so there's really 12 in the moderate volume group. There was actually 12 sets per week, and then the high volume group was 24 sets per week. And there wasn't really much difference in hypertrophy between between basically the 12 and 24 per week, but it was definitely better than the 6 per week or whatever. So even within just that study, it suggests the double-digit sets per week was definitely much better for hypertrophy. So, but again, there was no statistical significance, and when you're dealing with real small changes with small subject numbers, I mean, a good chunk of the time you're not going to see statistical significance just random probability you won't. So
just kind of like a tangential question, but like, do you think that the problem then is that the p-value is set too arbitrarily low? Because I think that the 0.05 is from the medical community. I think that that's their standard.
Yeah. Well, actually, it came from, it's been used in the medical community for a long time, but it actually came from, I don't even remember where it was started with now. It's something that wasn't even related to the medical community. And it's just, I don't remember. It had to, I wish, you'll have to look it up on the internet to find out where that 0.05 threshold came from.
Because I know in physics it's like really, really low. Like the standard is, higher in the sense that the p-value is really, really, really low.
Yeah.
It almost seems like cheating the system if you're putting in, if you're like claiming that like 0.07 or what have you is worth something. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a statistician, but I guess how do we combat this? Do we just get larger sample sizes, longer study durations, or?
Well, yeah. The hard part is with resistance training studies, it's almost impossible to get large enough subject numbers to really to do anything with, or a study that's long enough. I mean, most resistance training studies are on college age people, and usually the studies only last long enough for a semester or a quarter, which is why most resistance training studies are 12 to 15 weeks long or so. And it's just tough. It's tough to get, I didn't do a resistance training study, but I did my study that was published in Journal of Applied Physiology. It was an overtraining study on runners, and I had a hell of a time, and we even paid our subjects. I had a hell of a time recruiting people. We actually had to do 2, I had some dropouts and things from the first round, so I had to actually run the study again with some more subjects just to get enough. And I ended up with like 6 people per group. I mean, in my study, and it's just really hard to get people for these type of studies. Unless you pay them a hell of a lot of money, and usually for studies like this, you're not going to have enough money to pay them enough. Yeah. So it's almost, we're almost kind of stuck with what we have, a lot of studies with small sample sizes, and which limits us to, sometimes we're going to have to resort to meta-analyses or, accumulating data over time or looking things like at protein synthesis and kind of making projections from there, until someone does a study with, 50 to 100 people per group, that's kind of what we're stuck with.
Right.
So.
Okay. So at the beginning, you kind of mentioned that you're trying a higher frequency. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, before we get to that, I think there was another question you'd asked me about Fisher. I wanted to bring up. Comparing different studies that kind of got off tangent there, but comparing, one study has elderly and one study has this.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing with meta-analysis, so at least the way that meta-analysis is done. And I think this is where Fisher makes a mistake, is what they don't understand is that when I'm compiling effect sizes from multiple studies, I'm looking at the effect size, basically the difference in effect size within each study. So really, I'm not comparing it. It's not like I'm taking. It's really hard to explain.
I think I know what you're saying, actually. It's not like you're taking all of these individuals and pooling them together. You're pooling the effects from the controlled study itself together.
Yeah. And so, and basically I'm just looking at, okay, does the overall effect size in each of these studies, does it favor one group or does it not? And so, the fact that the studies are what we call heterogeneous doesn't take, it doesn't mean that we can't do an analysis like that. And actually, another thing that Fisher didn't really seem to understand is that I used a statistical model that is specifically basically meant for meta-analysis, which accounts for the fact that when I'm compiling studies together, there's a lot of sources of variance between studies that I can't account for. I mean, like you said, some studies are on elderly. There's different program designs, all these things. But I use a statistical model that basically says it's a very conservative model. It's extremely conservative, actually. I would call it's called a random effects model. For any statisticians that might be listening, but basically it in this model. It basically says that, okay, I can't account for everything, right? So we're going to kind of put a lot of uncertainty into our model, right? Basically, I'm incorporating a lot of uncertainty into the model. And I still saw an effect. Even when incorporating all this uncertainty into the model, basically, I used a statistical model that is actually very hard to see significant differences. And I still saw an effect. So that would be my counter to Fisher's criticism about looking at various heterogeneous studies. It's not uncommon in meta-analysis to have a lot of heterogeneity among studies. I mean, it happens all the time, but you can statistically control for that, I should say.
Right.
So
that actually makes a lot of sense. That's something I wouldn't have read into the discourse that's published online. So yeah. So there was one thing that I actually did want to get back to, though, with training to failure, and that was my point about the practical perspective, in that people tend to shy away from failure. They're really bad at gauging how close they are to failure, essentially. So training to failure is sort of like a way of standardizing how far people are going to take their sets, essentially.
And I definitely, especially for beginners, I think it's important because over time it's really important to kind of get a feel for, I don't think beginners will have a real good sense of how far away they are from failure.
Yeah.
Now, for more experienced trainees, I would say it's different. And I want to bring it. There's a study actually published in actually the same journal that Fisher published his critique in, Journal of Exercise Physiology Online. This was a study on powerlifters, and they didn't look at hypertrophy, but I think it's an important study to bring up. These powerlifters actually trained quite a ways away from failure. You might be kind of surprised on how far short of failure that they trained, and they trained with a pretty high frequency. And the results that they got, and these were experienced powerlifters. So these were competitive powerlifters, very advanced, and they had some amazing gains. And these were powerlifters and these were trainees that they were not even training close to failure. Um, so I would say for more advanced people, you can definitely train short of failure. Although I think you have to make up for that in other ways, either increasing your training volume in each session, or increasing your training frequency. And maybe that'd be a good foray into training frequency because
Yeah.
my current program I'm doing for myself, I'm actually stopping 3 to 5 reps short of failure, but I'm training extremely very high frequency. I'm training each body part like 5 to 6 days per week. So there's
Are
a
you
little
being
bit
coached
of
by
different
Menno
thinking.
by any chance?
What?
Are you being coached by Menno by any chance?
No, I'm not being
Okay.
coached by Menno, but the results he was getting with some of his clients was one of the things that kind of got me interested in experimenting with this type of training, along with some other data that I had seen. Um, uh, so that's why I'm experimenting with it right now. But again, right now it's just an experiment, and we'll see how it goes.
Right.
So
Um, I definitely want to talk about training frequency. I love talking about that. But I first, like, what do you think of the idea? So I hear the argument all the time that you should leave at least a rep or two in the tank for the sake of maximizing overall volume. So if you take your first set to failure, let's say you do 10 reps to failure, with the same weight, the next set you might only get 8 reps, and then with the next set you might only get 6 reps or whatever. So the total volume will be limited, whereas if you just went like 9 and left a rep in the tank, you might get 9 again and then 8 or something. So you get more overall reps at the same weight, right?
yeah,
I think that's the general idea. So what if instead of leaving a rep in the tank, if we assume that there is some value to taking a set to failure, if not from training studies, then at least from a mechanistic point of view, from a size principle point of view, then we could take the first set, second set, third set to failure, or what have you, and then do like just a drop set or whatever to make up for the volume that you would have lost by not leaving a rep in the tank. Do you think that would be as effective?
it might be. It's hard to say because there's really not much. There's almost no data on drop sets.
Yeah.
And actually, I was experimenting when I first started doing some of the high frequency stuff. It was actually right close to the end of my contest prep, and for a period of 3 weeks, 3 weeks before the contest, I actually way ramped up my training frequency, to 4 or 5, 6 days per week per body part, and I was doing a bunch of drop sets to make up for the fact that I had decreased my volume per session. And I also thought, well, drop sets, it's lighter weight, it won't be as tough on my joints and everything. So I would say there definitely could be some benefit to it. Unfortunately, there's no data out there to suggest whether it would work or not. Theoretically, I would think it would. But then the question becomes again, it would have to be balanced with training frequency and things like that, and overall fatigue management. But I think theoretically there may be a benefit, and it's something that's been in the back of my mind, and I actually want to mention it to Brad. I think there's an area of research that can be done there as far as on drop sets and things like that.
Interesting. Yeah, because it's more of like the hardcore bodybuilder in me, like, kind of favors that approach, because like you kind of just go as hard as you can, all out, kind of to failure, and then it's like I'll make up for the couple of sets that I lost, or the couple of reps that I lost, just with a drop set or two, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. As the research stands, it's hard to know one way or the other. And then the downside of that approach, like you kind of said, would be then the subsequent exercises. If you have more exercises for the same body part, you might be so fatigued to the point that like the total volume just will end up being lower.
Yeah.
So what I do is I make the practical recommendation, like probably leave a rep in the tank, and then take your last set of each exercise to failure, or at the very least the last set of your last exercise for a body part.
Yeah, that's actually the way I trained for quite a long time. I used to do, if I was doing, let's say 4 sets of 8 or whatever, basically I would try to choose a weight so that the fourth set, I'd be hitting failure by the 8th rep,
Right.
So, um, so yeah, I mean that's definitely another way to approach it.
Right. Okay, so now let's go on to the frequency stuff. So do you think that it makes more sense to have a greater per session training volume, or does it make more sense to space that volume out more evenly across the training week?
Well, I would say that if you look at the research as it stands now, it definitely seems to indicate it's better to space out your volume over the week with a higher frequency. One of Brad's recent studies showed that. He had guys just doing a regular bro split where they were basically training each body part once per week. And then he had the other group basically do the same number of sets per week, but now he split it up so that they were basically training each muscle group 3 days per week. And the hypertrophy, there was definitely superior hypertrophy in the higher frequency group. And that's actually in agreement with another study that was, I don't remember if it was on trained subjects or not. The author was McClester. The training volume was pretty low, but basically they had a 3 sets to failure once per week group, and then a 1 set to failure 3 days per week group. And the 1 set to failure 3 days per week group showed superior hypertrophy. And then Brad and I did a meta-analysis on training frequency that we published, and it's definitely indicated that the higher frequencies, at least 2 to 3 days per week, seem to be better than 1 day per week on a volume equated basis. So definitely the existing research seems to indicate that the higher frequency is better for hypertrophy. Unfortunately, there's not much research looking at frequencies of more than 3 days per week. I mean, almost all of it compares 1 to 3 or 2 to 3 or 1 to 2 or something like that. There's really only 2 or 3 published studies that I can think of where they've actually looked at training frequencies higher than 3 days per. Yeah, there's 3 studies I can think of that have looked at training frequencies higher than 3 days per week. All of those showed a benefit, but there's caveats to each one. So we definitely need more data along the lines of very high training frequencies. From a theoretical standpoint, when you look at protein synthesis response and how it responds to training, theoretically there is a benefit to higher frequencies, but we need way more research in that area.
Yeah. I agree that I think 2 to 3 times per week is probably maybe like a effective minimum that I'd probably recommend, broadly speaking. But I guess one of the issues that I have with the training frequency literature and Brad's in particular, not that it's like an issue, but just one of the things that Brad commented on himself is the novelty effect. So,
oh yeah,
right. I mean, like he had one group that did a bro split, and then he had another group that did an upper lower or something like that. So they were hitting it, I don't know, 2 or 3 times a week. I forget the exact frequency now, but all of the subjects were running bro splits from baseline. So one group essentially got no change, and the other group got a change. I think it would be interesting to then switch or have a study where you have people leading into the study running upper lower or something like that, something higher frequency, and then split them into bro split and upper lower and see if there's still an effect there.
Yes, and I would actually agree with that. I mean that is a definite limitation with this type of research. You don't know if the effect is truly an effective training frequency or just a novelty effect, and I would agree. It would be interesting to look at it, have the people switch, and then look at it that way.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that like as things stand, it seems like even on a mechanistic scale, so like you said, in terms of rates of muscle protein synthesis and how quickly they tend to return to baseline, it seems like recommending a frequency of at least twice a week is better than having a chest day, back day, arms day, legs day, shoulder day.
Yeah, at this point, yeah, definitely. I mean, the data definitely seems to indicate that for sure. So
even when volume matched.
Yeah.
One of the criticisms that I've voiced of the higher frequency style of training is that like when I've tried it myself and I have run like upper lower splits, push pull leg splits, I've never done like what you're doing, like 5 days per week. But I would imagine it would only exacerbate the criticisms that I have of the upper lower, which is that I just find like I don't get to push myself enough or something. Like I feel like I get like 1 exercise for my back or 2 exercises at best for that day, and then I'm done. It's like I don't feel like I'm getting enough intensity of effort on any given training day, and that could be more of a psychological than a physiological factor. But I do think it's significant in my specific case, and some of the people I've worked with as well.
Yeah, and it's definitely, especially with real high frequency training, you definitely have to approach it differently. Like I said, I mean, basically, I'm training each body part 5-6 days per week, and I'm not taking almost any sets to failure. I'm actually stopping well short of failure. But to me, the overload stimulus for me is the volume and the frequency that I'm manipulating. So yeah, I mean, it really, there's a certain personal preference involved. I mean, I remember seeing a blog post. This is a while back though, by Martin Birkin, and he's always been a very low frequency training guy.
Low volume too, I think.
Yeah, low volume too. And he had a blog post back then, but he never did a follow-up post that he was going to experiment with some high frequency training. But he was just, it didn't seem to fit his personality, because he was a guy that when he went in the gym, he had to just go balls out. Yeah. Right. And if you're going to train with a really high frequency, you can't train like that, because you definitely will overtrain very quickly. So there's a trade-off there. If you're the type of person that you gotta have that feeling like I want to train balls out when I'm training, then higher frequency training probably isn't the best for you, just because it doesn't fit it doesn't fit your I wouldn't say it doesn't fit your goals, but it doesn't fit I guess maybe your personality in a sense. I mean, so yeah, because that's the thing with higher frequency training, you have to actually you got to hold back. You have to hold back, because you're going to be coming back again. Sometimes, like for me, I'm coming back the next day, so I can't be pushing myself too hard, because I know I'm going to be doing this again tomorrow. So exactly. On the same body parts. So
right. So the last question that I have for you, James, is one that I've kind of just been like playing around with in my mind myself, and it kind of comes from this idea that so like I'm a power lifter in my off season, and the whole reason I got into powerlifting was so that I would be stronger, so that I could push more weight in the bodybuilding rep ranges when I get back to them, be able to move more volume, and then get bigger. Might have been a bit of a lofty goal for me. I'm not convinced that I'm significantly, I mean, I think my physique has improved, but not to the point that you might expect it to be, given the absolute tonnage, like the increase in the absolute tonnage that I'm now handling or able to handle because of the strength training that I did. Yeah. So I guess the question would be, do you think that relative volume or absolute volume is more important from a hypertrophy standpoint?
That's a really...
Let me just clarify for the listeners in case they don't know what I mean by those terms. So like relative volume would be sets times reps times the percent of your 1RM, whereas absolute volume would be reps times sets times the actual load that you're lifting. So it stands to reason that my relative volume might not have actually increased as a result of my powerlifting, but my absolute volume did, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I'm still undecided as to what I think is more important, but
that's a really tough question, because it's and I don't know if there is a good answer to it, because there's so many variables that are at play even there. So I mean, let's just take absolute volume for example. Even you look at absolute, I mean, well, I had mentioned earlier that let's say if I'm doing really high rep sets, I have to do more absolute volume to get the same hypertrophy than if I were using heavier weights. So so just looking at absolute volume alone is kind of limited. I can't just look at that. Because there's other variables at play, and I would say probably the same is true for the relative volume as well. Um, so I don't know if there's a really good answer to that question. I think probably both variables are important to a point, but one of the limitations of looking at absolute volume and stuff, and this is probably, I think, comes along with your experience as a powerlifter, and I'm seeing this more and more in the research. There's so many people that say, well, if I want to get bigger, I got to get stronger, right? And so many people say that, and I don't think people have an appreciation for how much neural adaptations
Yeah.
play a role in increases in strength. And actually, I just reviewed a paper. I had accepted it with minor revisions, but the other two reviewers rejected it, so it looks like it's not going to get published unless it has some major revisions. But what I saw in the paper was that they had one group do high load training, they had another group do low load training, and then they had a mixed group that did some high, some low load for a period of time, and all the sets were taken to failure. And this gets back to the point that, hey, as long as you're taking the sets to failure and you're doing the same number of sets, your hypertrophy is going to be similar. Now, this was on untrained subjects, so they didn't have much training experience, but the hypertrophy was similar among all the groups, but the strength gains, like, here's what was interesting. For example, the low load group didn't have much in the way of strength gains, even though their hypertrophy was similar to the high load group, but the high load group had enormous strength gains.
Right.
And what I think that shows you is that, yes, a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, but there's way, way, way more things that play a role in strength development than just muscle size. And so I think that's why we need to be careful when saying, oh, hey, my poundages are going up in the gym, I must be getting bigger. Well, that may not necessarily be the case, especially if you're doing powerlifting style training.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and that's been my experience, and it's been my experience when you go around to powerlifting meets. Oftentimes, the best guys in the weight class have less, or yeah, the strongest guys, I should say, in my weight class, for example, have a lot less muscle than me.
yeah.
So I do think that all else being equal, a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, but I'm not necessarily convinced it goes the other way around, that a stronger muscle is necessarily a bigger muscle. I feel like
Yeah, it doesn't go the other way around.
Yeah. So for people who might be listening who are considering getting into powerlifting for the sake of improving their physique, which is an extremely popular thing within the natural bodybuilding community, do you think that that's a good idea from a purely physiological perspective? Hard to say, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if you need to get into powerlifting to, there's some data, but I don't think the data is really strong at this point, that maybe varying your repetition ranges is probably best for hypertrophy, but really to do full powerlifting cycles, of training. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced myself that it would really, and I think this probably jives with your experience. I'm not really that convinced that it would really be beneficial from a physique standpoint. I think there's probably some benefit in incorporating lower repetition ranges within your training, but if you're going to start going full out competing for powerlifting and training that way, I don't know. I'm just not sure it's going to do a whole lot for overall hypertrophy and physique enhancement. I mean, I kind of agree with your assessment. I mean, I've seen some pretty either skinny guys or not very big guys that can deadlift a lot of poundage.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think even Menno has said this, about the deadlift. A lot of people like to deadlift, but you think about it, I don't know if the deadlift is really a great size building exercise. I've actually kind of decided to cut it out of my own training because I just think there's probably, if I'm just trying to purely get bigger, I think there's better choices. But yeah, I just think, powerlifting is, the goal in powerlifting is totally different. And some of the size you get from it is just more of a byproduct or a side effect, I should say, um, rather than rather than yet something that, oh yeah, I should be powerlifting to get as big as possible.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I think powerlifting too much with like losing sight of your bodybuilding goals and totally focusing on powerlifting, which is essentially what I did, uh, can be a way to notice some imbalances in your physique. So like the arms clearly don't get much work. Like the triceps not bad, but the biceps get virtually nothing.
yeah,
The shoulders, like the side delts and rear delts, get very little
yeah,
work. Like a lot of powerlifters are kind of rolled forward unless they do
yeah,
work for the upper back and the rear delts and so on. And but I do think it added quite a bit of size or at least density, to use a bro term, to my lower back, glutes, even hamstrings.
yeah,
And I do attribute that to all of the deadlifting. And then another positive from the powerlifting would just be from a psychological perspective, because like off season after off season of kind of doing the same bodybuilding style training can get a little bit dry, and then
yeah,
powerlifting gives you something like objective to actually measure, like I'm this
yeah,
strong at this lift, so it's motivating in that sense.
yeah,
But yeah, I would just caution people to make sure that if they still have physique related goals, then keeping in a sufficient enough volume for the like accessory body parts
yeah,
is really really important. And
yeah,
yeah, like you said, if your goal is just to maximize your physique, then if you want to get into powerlifting, would probably be more a matter of personal preference or whatever.
yeah,
Maybe.
yeah.
Yeah. So James, I guess that this will I'll conclude it here, but I thought it was a really enlightening conversation, and it was really really nice to chat with you about some of that stuff, because it's stuff I've been playing around with in my mind for a while, and I
Yeah.
feel as though we connected on a lot of the ideas. So I appreciate your time very much.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'd love to have you come on. I know you were supposed to debate was it D.H. Kiefer? Is that his name?
Kiefer, yeah.
Yeah. That didn't go through after, did it? Because I never heard anything about it. I wasn't there.
No, Kiefer never showed up.
He just didn't
So
show.
it was just me talking. It was just me talking for 2 hours, which actually was probably the best thing, because a lot of people just love the talk, and I had so many people come up to me. They were actually said, "Oh, I'm glad Kiefer didn't show up," because they really enjoyed my talk and stuff. So
Yeah. I just find your stuff on insulin and everything to do with metabolism just to be fantastic. So I'd love to have you come on and maybe talk about some of that stuff at some
oh
point in
yeah,
time. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear from you again.
yeah,
All right, so that's going to conclude this episode. Thank you so much, guys, for watching, and thank you, James, for your time. Before we go, I'd like to give you a quick minute to just tell people where it is that they can find you, so your website and any social media.
yeah. So you can find my website, weightology.net, WEIGHTLOGOY.net. You'd mentioned my research review. I don't. I just have back issues now because I don't regularly write on it now. But that's called Weightology Weekly, and you can access all the back issues for a one-time fee. You can follow me on Twitter. I've actually got 2 different Twitter accounts, but my main fitness-related one would be Weightology. So you can just look up Weightology on Twitter, and I'm also on Facebook. You can look me up on Facebook, just James Krieger. And you'll know it's me because I'm friends with a lot of people in the fitness community. So, and I'm also giving a number of talks this year. I'm talking at in England in April, the Personal Trainer Collective Conference. So if you're going to happen to be in England, or if you're a listener that's in England or in Europe, that's April 23rd and 24th, I think, and you can go to personaltrainercollective.com. Then I'll be talking in Australia in June, and that's called the Bropocalypse.
I saw the poster for that.
Yeah, so that's
you look like the most sensible person on there. I'm not gonna lie. Brett is shirtless. Alan has the American flag reflected in his glasses.
No.
And I forget what Brad is doing, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so that's in Sydney, Australia in June, and it's put on by 2 buff girls. So And then I'll be speaking at the AFPT conference in Norway in August. So if any of your listeners are in any of those areas and want to catch one of those conferences, I'd love to meet them. So
yeah, excellent. Okay, well, thank you once again, James, and thank you guys for listening to another episode, and we will see you in the next one.